In popular television portrayals, Margaret Beaufort is often shown as a ruthless schemer, willing to stop at nothing to secure the throne for her son. But in this video, my goal is to reclaim her name and recognise her as one of the most extraordinary women in England's history. How did she go from being a 13-year-old mother to the matriarch of the most famous royal dynasty, the Tudors? Let us trace her life's path together. Margaret Beaufort was born on May 31st, either in 1441 or 1443. As you probably remember from my earlier videos, back then there wasn't really a proper system for recording birthdays, especially for girls, which is why, for most women of that era, the exact dates remain a mystery. But in Margaret's case, while we can't be certain about the year, we know the day without a doubt, because she ordered that her birthday be celebrated at Westminster Abbey on May 31st. Now, to understand Margaret's background, and why her son Henry VII even claimed the English throne, or rather, whether he had any real claim at all. Spoiler, not really, just a very distant one. We need to dive into the messy web of marriages and love affairs of 15th century England, as well as the story of the Wars of the Roses. I'll do my best to make sense of this genealogical and political chaos in plain language, because this was such a turbulent time in England's history that, honestly, to figure it out, you'll need not just patience, but probably a glass of wine as well. Her father was John Beaufort, great-grandson of King Edward III and grandson of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the very founder of the royal house of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose. But you might be wondering, if that's the case, why is she called Margaret Beaufort and not, say, Margaret of Lancaster? The answer lies in John of Gaunt's third marriage, which was to his mistress. Though the children of this union were later legitimised, they were barred from the throne and given the surname Beaufort, most likely in honour of the Duke's former French possession, the castle of Beaufort, meaning beautiful stronghold. Now, Margaret's father may not have had a royal claim, but he was wealthy, respected as a military commander, and his only surviving child was Margaret. After his sudden, mysterious death, she became a very desirable bride, even though she was only a year old. In fact, at that time, her first marriage was arranged to John de la Pole, the son of her guardian. Margaret herself never even recognised that marriage, and it was annulled 3 years later. But such a bride did not remain unattached for long. Even before the annulment, a new suitor appeared, Edmund Tudor. He would later become her husband and the father of her child, and his surname would be carried by one of the most famous dynasties in English history. But who exactly was Edmund, and who were the Tudors at that time? The Tudors were an ancient and powerful Welsh family, but with no royal blood. Their path to the throne began with the forbidden love between Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, Margaret Beaufort's future parents-in-law. Catherine was the Dowager Queen of England and the mother of King Henry VI, himself a descendant of John of Gaunt and a member of the House of Lancaster. Owen served at court, and the two married in secret. They had 2 sons, Jasper and Edmund Tudor. Because through their mother, the brothers were half-siblings to the king, and because Henry VI had long failed to produce an heir, he drew them close to himself, granting them not only influence, but also guardianship over young Margaret Beaufort. Thus, at the age of 12, Margaret married Edmund Tudor, who was 25 at the time. So, if we look closely at the Tudor dynasty's origins, their claim to the English crown was in truth rather tenuous. The historian Alison Weir even calls their dynasty bastard stock. Edmund Tudor died in captivity when his 13-year-old wife was 7 months pregnant. Quite often, when I mentioned that Margaret's marriage was too early, I received comments saying that it was considered normal for the time. Indeed, marriages were often arranged at very young ages, but consummation was usually postponed until the woman had reached a certain level of maturity. As Dr. Elizabeth Norton, historian, explains, it was perfectly acceptable to marry a child in the 15th century, but you didn't have sex with them. So why did Edmund not wait until his wife had grown older? I often come across the opinion that it was due to Margaret's inheritance, which he could lay claim to as soon as the marriage was consummated, and in the event of her death. On January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle, a boy was born who would one day become king, although at the time his path to the throne was extremely remote: Henry Tudor. The difficulties Margaret faced during childbirth, as well as the fact that Henry remained her only child, strongly suggest that her body was simply unprepared and that she likely suffered a birth injury. Considering also her petite frame, the very fact that she survived childbirth and delivered a living, healthy son can only be described as a miracle. Later, when her son arranged for her granddaughter, also named Margaret, to marry at the age of 13, she objected. Concerned about her granddaughter's well-being, she successfully postponed the marriage until the girl was 15. What's striking is that, despite all she endured, Margaret always honoured Edmund as the father of her only child. She even asked to be buried beside him, though her closest and longest-lasting relationship in life was with her third husband. At just 15, the young widow, Margaret, married her cousin, Sir Henry Stafford, 20 years older than she was. Her son, meanwhile, went into the care of his uncle Jasper Tudor. That was life back then. Imagine being only 15 and already on your third husband. But don't think of her as a mother who abandoned her child. That was simply how things worked in those days. As I've said before, with men dying in battle and women so often lost in childbirth, it was common for people to have 3 or even 4 spouses in a lifetime. This marriage brought wealth to Stafford and gave Margaret valuable political protection. By all accounts, it seems to have been a happier match for her. She oversaw the running of Woking Palace, and, although rarely, she did have the chance to visit her son. Now, in The White Queen and its sequels, we're shown a love story between Jasper Tudor and Margaret. But history gives us no real proof of that. Most likely, their relationship was entirely strategic, with one purpose only: keeping Henry alive and getting him to the throne. Still, what do you think? Was there a spark between Margaret and her brother-in-law? In 1461, the House of York rose to power with Edward IV, the White Rose of the Wars of the Roses, and this put Henry's life in real danger. Losing his lands to the king's brother was bad enough, but worse was the fact that when the old Lancastrian king Henry VI was briefly restored, Margaret appeared at court with her son, making her Lancastrian loyalties crystal clear. Like I said, a turbulent time. In 1470, Henry Stafford was badly injured in battle and eventually died from his wounds. That was the moment she realised it was no longer safe for her son to remain in England. Henry was 13, already considered a man in those days. She begged Jasper Tudor to take him across the sea to Brittany. He did, but it also meant she would not see her only child again for 14 years. I honestly can't imagine the kind of self-control and faith it must have taken not to go mad, knowing your son is far away, walking such a dangerous path. But Margaret never wasted time. She was working behind the scenes, laying the groundwork for Henry's claim to the throne. Part of this was her third marriage, to Lord Thomas Stanley. It wasn't for love, it was for politics. And in the end, it was Stanley who would secure Henry's decisive victory at Bosworth and place the crown on his head. Before that, though, he brought Margaret back into favour at Edward's court, where she built a connection with Elizabeth Woodville, even becoming godmother to one of her daughters. In April 1483, the wheel of fortune spun again for Margaret and her son. Edward IV died suddenly at just 40 years old, and his young son was declared king. But he never wore the crown, because not long after, both he and his younger brother, Prince Richard, mysteriously vanished. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped in and took the throne as Richard III. The mystery of the princes in the Tower is one of the greatest unsolved stories of history. Most people believe Richard III had them killed to secure his crown. But there are also theories that Margaret herself might have had a hand in their disappearance. True, their vanishing did move her son 2 steps closer to the throne, but there's no solid evidence linking her to it. Still, all 3 TV series laid the blame squarely on Margaret. What do you think really happened to the princes? Some even claim they escaped and went on to live long lives under different names. Even in that crazy political game, Margaret managed to survive. She served the new queen, Anne Neville, even carrying her train at the coronation. All the while she was waiting, patiently like a spider spinning her web, and plotting with the Dowager Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. The plan was simple. Elizabeth would offer her eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth of York, in marriage to Henry Tudor, Margaret's son. Together, they would topple Richard III and start a brand new dynasty, uniting both Lancasters and Yorks. And yes, that's exactly what eventually happened, but not right away. Their first attempt, a rebellion led by the Duke of Buckingham, was crushed. Buckingham was executed, and Margaret herself came dangerously close to the same fate. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest under her husband's watch, stripped of her lands and titles. But the single most important day for Margaret and her son came on August 22nd, 1485, the Battle of Bosworth. Richard may have had the bigger army, and he fought with real courage, but the key moment came when Margaret's husband finally made his move. At first he seemed reluctant to commit his troops, but at the last moment he threw his weight behind his stepson and personally placed the fallen king's crown on Henry's head. And just like that, Margaret became My Lady the King's mother, and her son, Henry Tudor, was crowned the very first Tudor King of England. Margaret gained a level of power and freedom almost unheard of for women in the 15th century. She was officially declared a femme sole. This meant she could act independently of her husband, owning property in her own name, and even taking cases to court. These were rights most married women could only dream of. Before Henry came to the throne, she had signed her documents as M. Richmond. Afterwards, she began using Margaret R. And while the R could still stand for Richmond, I can't help but think she meant Regina, the Latin for queen, the female counterpart of Rex. Margaret wasn't about to accept a place beneath her daughter-in-law, or the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville. She wore robes of the same quality as the Queen Consort, and walked only half a pace behind her. In TV series, we see Margaret and Elizabeth of York shown as enemies, but Elizabeth's biographer, Amy Licence, reminds us. Only one person knew how Elizabeth really felt about Margaret, and she did not commit it to paper. In other words, there's no proof they disliked each other. On the contrary, it's said Margaret accompanied the king and queen on royal tours during the early years of their marriage, and even created a clear set of rules about how members of the royal family, especially women, were to be treated. Most likely, she and Elizabeth built a solid professional kind of relationship. So, what kind of relationship did the grown-up Henry have with his mother? Remember, they hadn't seen each other for 14 years. She had said goodbye to a teenager, and met again a full-grown man. We don't know if there was a deep, heartfelt closeness between them. But one thing is clear, Henry knew exactly who had cleared the path to the throne for him, and he was deeply grateful. Here's a passage from one of his surviving letters to Margaret. All which things, according to your desire and pleasure, I have with all my hearte and goody willy giffen and granted unto you. I shall be as glad to please you as your hearte can desire hit, and I know well that I am as much bounden so to do as any creature living, for the great and singular motherly love and affection that hit hath placed you at all times to bear towards me. Margaret's story didn't end with putting her son on the throne. Her influence reached much further. She was a lifelong patron of the arts and of learning. In fact, she played a key role in the growth of Cambridge, where she is still celebrated as a founder. In 1497, she even announced plans to build a free school for the people of Wimborne, and after her death, part of her fortune went to Oxford. She funded the building of chapels in Wales, supported William Caxton in his groundbreaking work with printing, and even made her own mark as a translator. She was the first known English translator of the Imitation of Christ. So, yes, she was an extraordinary woman. And honestly, she didn't have time for the kind of petty drama where she's shown grabbing Catherine of Aragon in castle corridors. She had far more meaningful things on her plate. If you've seen her portraits, you'll notice she's often shown in simple religious robes instead of furs and jewels like other queens and noble ladies. That's because she took a vow of chastity, even while still married. She kept good relations with her third husband until his death, after which she renewed that vow once again. In 1509, the very person for whom Margaret had given her whole life, her son Henry, died. Losing a child is always heartbreaking, but for Margaret, it must have felt absolutely devastating. She outlived him by only 2 months, passing away just 5 days after the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII, the infamous womanizer king. Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, the true mother of the Tudor dynasty, died on June 29, 1509, at the age of 66. In the story of the Wars of the Roses, the Earl of Warwick is remembered as the Kingmaker. But if you ask me, that title belongs without question to Margaret Beaufort. a woman ahead of her time who lived the kind of life most people of that era, men or women, could never even dream of. She knew how to play the big game, and she chose to be a player, not a pawn, on the chessboard of history. So, what do you think of Margaret Beaufort? Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.